Welcome to Biology 177 for kinesiology majors. My name is Dr. Brian Khan Quintana. I'm going to be your professor for the course, and this is the first lecture of the semester, an introduction to anatomy and physiology. All right, so anatomy and physiology. We can begin with asking the question, what is anatomy? And very briefly stated, anatomy is going to be the study of body structures and their physical interrelationships. So, for example, if we're studying something like the arm, we would be learning about the structure of the arm. So perhaps we would be learning about the bone that makes up the arm, the humerus, for example. We might be studying the different muscles that make up the arm, or we might be studying the different tissues that make up the arm. So that is anatomy, the study of these structures. Okay, so physiology. What is physiology? Okay, so physiology is the study of how these structures are going to function normally. Okay, so physiology is the study of how these structures are going to function in a normal living organism. So there's another branch similar to physiology. If you would notice, I was emphasizing on the term normal. I said that physiology is a study of the normal functioning of the system. Um, so if we were studying the abnormal functioning, we would call this pathophysiology. So you might have noticed that we've added a word in front of the term physiology. We added the term patho. Okay, and patho, it's the root word for something that is diseased. Okay, so pathophysiology would be the study of abnormal functioning. So we're going to focus mostly on the former, but I'll bring up pathologies once in a while to highlight how these systems work, or basically how they don't work. So anatomy and physiology are going to provide us with a comprehensive understanding of the different structures and the functions that these structures have, and how the two are interrelated within a living system. Okay, now there are also going to be common meeting ground. Anatomy and physiology, that is a common meeting ground for biology, chemistry, mathematics, physics, and even engineering. So let's go ahead and begin by learning some basic principles. So this slide here is basically describing how living systems are organized. Sometimes books talk about the organization of living systems. Right here, we're describing it as emergent properties in living systems. So, what we're talking about here basically is how anatomy and physiology, once again, it's an integrative study, and no single part of the body can be fully understood when viewing it on its own or by itself. All of the different parts of the body are going to be interconnected, either structurally or functionally. Now, for biologists, this interconnectedness is what makes the study of living systems both fascinating and challenging. So, again, what do I mean by integrate? Okay, now, well, integration occurs across all levels of organization. So, we're going to see integration at the biochemical level. Okay, we're going to see basically the different levels of organization, which would include at the biochemical level. We would talk about organelles and cells. Okay, now we would talk about tissues, which are collections of cells, organs, which are collections of tissues, organ systems, which are collections of organs, and then the whole organism, which is among individuals of a species. So, what do we mean by that? Well, if you refer to the slide here that's in front of you, a simple way of kind of explaining it here is how we're saying that how life emerges from parts in a eukaryotic cell. So we have different parts, parts, basically saying that we get all these different individual parts, and these parts are going to come together somehow, and they're going to be arranged into a certain structure. So in this case, we're saying certain things came together to form a cell. And what then happens from here is we get emergent behaviors as a result of that. So when going back to what we were just talking about here, and the integration that we find across all levels of organization, the part here that we're saying, part. So when we study biology, we learn that those parts, what we're really referring to, are different chemicals. So the chemicals that we find on the periodic table, for example. And those chemicals come together to form larger components like molecules and compounds. And then those come together to form even larger elements. And they sorry about that. So these different components come together to form even larger components. So we're saying these different chemicals would come together to form compounds and molecules, and those compound and molecules would form things that are even larger. Now, some of those larger structures would include things like carbohydrates, things like lipids, things like fats, fatty acids, and eventually those components, one way that they can eventually be arranged is to form cells. And that's what you're seeing here in the center of this slide. It's an example of a cell. And then, just to mention here, you'll see that cell is actually made up of these different components where we're saying the nucleus, the nucleolus, the mitochondria, the ribosomes. Those are something called organelles. And again, organelles are made up of different subcomponents. And organelles, they function kind of like organs do in humans, where they're going to have a specific role or a specific function that's important for the survival of the cell. Okay, so we've got this cell now that's formed by different organelles, and these cells can come together and they can form something called tissues. Okay, so tissues are collections of cells. And if we get two or more different types of tissues, we form a larger structure called an organ. Okay, organs are collections of tissues. And those organs would also come together to form organ systems. So, for example, we can talk about the four different types of tissues, which are going to be epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. And we might get those tissues in an organ like the stomach, where it would contain connective, muscular, epithelial, and nervous tissue. However, the stomach would be, it's an organ. However, it would be part of a larger system when it works in conjunction with other organs like the small intestine, the large intestine, in order to form an organ system. That's the digestive system I'm describing. Okay, and then all the organ systems would come together to form an organism, okay, which is an individual in a species. Okay, so that's basically, once again, what we're talking about here is that, one of the main themes of anatomy and physiology is that, we kind of need to study these systems and understand these systems as interconnected. Okay. All right. And again, we're going to see this theme of integration across all levels of levels of organization that we just mentioned. And we also see integration across the different body systems. And the different body systems that we'll talk about shortly include the integumentary, the musculoskeletal, the nervous, the cardiovascular, the immune, the respiratory, the renal, the endocrine, the digestive, and the reproductive. Now, I was just mentioning a term where I said the term that I said was themes in physiology. And one of the very important themes in physiology is the structure-function relationship. So it's often true in biology that understanding the structure of something is going to provide the clue to its function. And the reverse is also true. So, for example, if you study the structure of something, for example, you study that, something has wheels, for example, then you would imagine that the function of that object would be to, roll and move on those wheels. Okay, so again, you're able to kind of make these hypotheses or these guesses, these real educated guesses of, structure and function by that understanding that function is dependent on structure and that structure is going to dictate function. Now, at its most basic, the principle that we're talking about states that there's going to be a close relationship between structure, and again, we can talk about the structure at a molecular, a cellular, or a tissue level, and we're saying that there's a relationship between that structure and that physiological function. Okay, another example that we can give here is the example of athletic training. So athletic training would result in enlarged skeletal muscles, for example. But muscle cells would shrink if that training would stop, if basically the functional demands were to stop. Okay, so structure-function relationships are never perfect. and all structures are going to serve more than one function. So we're going to examine many examples of structure-function relationships during this course. Now, another important thing to talk about here is that all living things are going to consist of cells. This is part of what we call the cell theory of life. Now, this theory states that cells are going to be the structural building blocks of all living organisms, and that cells don't just pop into existence, they come from pre-existing cells. Okay, another important idea here is that a cell is going to be the smallest unit that has all of the characteristics of life. And the human body actually has over 200 different types of cells. Now, many of which we're going to examine actually in this course. Okay, now another important principle here that we can talk about is that life requires energy. So all living organisms are designed in large part to obtain, store, convert, and use energy. So these activities occur at all levels of organization, and basically from the production of ATP, which is the chemical source of energy that we're going to talk about later, to all the way up to obtaining, ingesting, and digesting food. And then lastly here, the last major theme or principle in physiology that we'll talk about is homeostasis. And this is perhaps the most commonly discussed theme underlying the study of living organisms. So again, just to summarize here, the different principles, the different themes of physiology is that anatomy and physiology are integrative. We said that, when we're studying anatomy and physiology, we need to understand that smaller things come together to really build larger things. To understand the smaller things, we need to understand, or rather, I should say that to understand the larger things, we need to understand the smaller things. And also, we said that there's a relationship between structure and function. Okay, we also said that all living things consist of cells, that life requires energy, and that homeostasis maintains inner stability of cells. And that's a very important underlying topic that we're going to get into shortly. So, homeostasis. So homeostasis is actually quite dynamic. Okay, so homeostasis, we can say, is actually the dynamic maintenance of a normal internal environment, despite changes to the external environment. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Okay, what we're trying to emphasize here is that homeostasis is not the maintenance of a constant, static internal environment where internally nothing changes. That's not what we're saying. That would be rather impossible. What we're rather saying here is that the maintenance of physiological variables within a narrow range of values is what we're looking for. Okay, so what we mean by that, in other terms, is, we have different types of variables. And there are environmental variables like temperature or pH or osmolarity. There are cellular needs like nutrients, water, ions, oxygen, internal secretions like hormones, intercellular communication, for example. And what we're saying here is that these different variables environmental, cellular needs, internal secretions, can change. Okay? These different variables can change either externally or internally. And homeostasis is the maintenance of a normal range that's acceptable for life. Okay, so again, so if we're saying that homeostasis is basically the maintenance of physiological variables within a normal narrow range of values, okay, and we gave some examples like environmental, cellular needs, and internal secretions. Okay, so what are some examples of internal environments? Okay, so essentially it's everything that we find inside the body. Okay, which includes, when we talk about inside the body, that includes two fluid-filled compartments essentially. Those two fluid-filled compartments include intracellular, and the other one would be extracellular. Okay, intracellular would include everything that we find inside the cell. Sometimes we call that ICF. And extracellular would be everything that we find outside the cell. So we call that ECF. Okay, and that even includes what we would find flowing through our blood vessels. All right, so again, before we actually move on here, just to summarize what we're saying. So homeostasis is the dynamic maintenance of normal internal environment despite changes in the external environment. Um, and then those variables that we said might change could be environmental, they could be cellular needs, and we said that homeostasis is that important maintenance um, of that dynamic range. Okay, it's not static. So when it comes down to it, cells really don't like changes either in the extracellular or intracellular environments. And they're going to initiate responses to bring themselves back to within normal ranges whenever they're pushed outside those ranges. And that kind of brings us into this next example here with mass balance and set points. So many homeostatic mechanisms and responses have to do with what we call mass balancing. Okay, and that basically means that's the amount of a substance that remains within a normal narrow range by balancing gains and losses of a particular substance. Now, for example, massive losses of water through, example we can say is sweating or diarrhea, that must be balanced by increasing the water intake, for example. And if there's a failure to do that, homeostasis is not going to be maintained. So, an individual who's, like, again, sweating through exercise, they're losing more water than they're taking in. They're going to be thrown out of balance. So, they would be thrown out of homeostasis. So mass balancing would include that, taking in that water in order to make up for what was lost. So again, a somewhat simplified way of thinking about this is that each internal variable in our body has a set point, and internal mechanisms exist to ensure that the variable remains close to its target. Now, set points, however, can change either due to outside factors, for example, disease or injury, or they can change in body conditions, for example, growth, development, aging, pregnancy. Now, if the body deviates from the normal range of a set point, that would therefore cause a pathology, or the term that we gave was disease. So these homeostatic control mechanisms, basically the mechanisms that the body has to stay within homeostasis, they include feedback mechanisms and feed forward loops. And that's what we want to talk about next. So essentially, the body is going to use various different control mechanisms to maintain the body around its set point. Okay, so for example, the normal set point for an individual, for temperature, 98.6 degrees. But if we were to talk about, let's say the example that we could see here on the slide is talking about room temperature, and is talking about how an air conditioner might work, first of all, before we get into the body. Okay, so the body works in a very similar way. Okay, where the body's going to use various control mechanisms to maintain that set point that we're talking about. And that's what the graph is showing you here. So we have this set point, this normal range of temperature which is acceptable in the room. Okay, and the body does the same thing. There's a normal set point for different physiological variables. And all control mechanisms are going to function as variations of the following idea, where we're going to get some type of input. The input, for example, in the case that we're talking about here, could be temperature. Then there's going to be some type of integration. The integration would be, that temperature being detected by a thermostat, and then the thermostat kind of deciding what needs to be done. If for example, the air conditioner needs to be turned on to lower the ambient temperature of the room, which would be therefore considered the output. Okay, and then that output information would lead to the response, which would actually be turning on that air conditioner. So once again, these control mechanisms include the input, integration, the output, and the response. So these control mechanisms can be somewhat arbitrarily divided into local control mechanisms and long-distance response loops. Now, in both of these cases, the general response loop is going to be the same, where there's a stimulus. Once again, the example of the stimulus that we talked about could be temperature. And then we have a sensor. So the example of the sensor that we can talk about here would be a thermometer. And then we're going to get that input signal. The input signal is, I guess we can imagine as the information of the cold temperature that is being transmitted through the cables in the room. And then we have the integrative center. The integrative center is it could be the thermostat, or it could be the component which essentially is going to decide what to do with the information. Okay, and then once we have a decision of what to do with that information, okay, that the response, in other words, when we know what that response is, that basically is going to be sent out from the thermostat with what we would consider the output signal. That output signal eventually is going to travel to the target, okay? Okay, and then finally from the target, we're going to get a response. And we'll cover that again. I know it's somewhat complex. We'll cover that again soon in a few slides, and it's also on the notes. So the only significant difference is where the integrative center is found between local control mechanisms and long distance response loops. So it's going to be near the area being affected, or is it far away? This applies to the output signal as well. Does it only affect nearby tissue, or does it affect tissues that are far away from the site that are being released? Okay, we could also talk about local control loops and long distance control loops. All right. So local control loops is where the integrative center and the output signal both occur within individual tissue in direct response to changes in the immediate environment. For example, as oxygen concentrations decrease in an active tissue, blood vessels in the area will respond to the decreased oxygen by dilating or increasing diameter in order to allow more blood and oxygen to perfuse or to enter the tissue. And long distance response loops is where the integrative signal is almost always in the central nervous system, and the output signal often travels far distances to affect tissues throughout the body. For example, touching a hot stove burner. So in this case, you have the heat, which would be detected by the pain receptors, which would then send that signal via the nerves to the brain or the reflex center, would then send it to the CNS, to the nerves and muscles, cause the muscles to contract and to move your hand. Okay, so as you can see, response loops are involved in the detection of changes from the normal set point, which then lead to some sort of response in the body. So it's important to understand that many response loops don't simply end after one response, but instead they're continuously monitored, or they're continuously monitoring the stimulus, and the response is determined whether further action is needed. So this input of information is called feedback, and it leads to two specific kinds of feedback response loops. We get either negative feedback loops, or rather I should say negative feedback responses, or positive feedback response. So again, these are the different main components of these homeostatic mechanisms that we're talking about. So we have the receptor, okay, which is going to bring in that input information. Okay, so this is going to be the sensor that monitors the environment and responds to changes, called the stimuli. It's going to send the information being the input, to the integration center, or sometimes called the control center. The integrative center is going to process that information. It analyzes that input, and it determines an appropriate response. And then the effector and the output, so the integrative center is going to respond, okay, and the effector is going to respond to those commands from the control center in order to provide the means for the response. Okay, so in the example that we were talking about here, we can kind of talk about the two put together. So we're talking about a normal condition is disturbed. So talking about room temperature. So the stimulus in this case would be the room temperature rising. And then we said that there's a receptor. The receptor was the thermometer. The thermometer is picking up on that stimulus of the increase in the room temperature. So that receptor is going to send that information to the control center. That's essentially input information that's being sent to the control center. The control center is going to say, well, the room temperature is rising, and what I need to do is I need to lower the room temperature to get back into the normal range. So I need to turn on the air conditioner. So the control center is going to send that output information to the effector. Okay, the effector being the air conditioner, and it's going to tell the air conditioner to turn on, which would eventually cause a response, which would be the room temperature dropping and hopefully back to normal room temperature. Homeostasis would be restored. Okay, so again, talking about these feedback mechanisms, the one that we just described now with the temperature, that would be considered a negative feedback mechanism. And we have two feedback mechanisms, like I just mentioned earlier. There's negative feedback mechanisms and there's positive feedback mechanisms. So negative feedback mechanisms, those are the ones that we typically say are homeostatic, which means that they bring us back into homeostasis. So most reflexes are going to be homeostatic, and they're going to work to return a variable back to its set point. This requires feedback that moves the variable in the opposite direction back to normal from what was originally initiated away from. So in other words, negative feedback, we're going to receive a signal, and the response that we give is usually in the opposite direction of the original stimulus. So if the original stimulus, for example, was that it was getting hot, the response would be the opposite of what hot is. It would be to cool us down. Okay, that's the main idea for negative feedback. It basically goes the opposite direction, back to normal. If it was too cold, okay, negative feedback would go the opposite way, and it would want us to heat up. So again, this requires feedback that moves the variable in an opposite direction back to normal from what was originally initiated away from normal. Okay, so another example I can give, like blood pressure maintenance. So maintaining normal blood pressure is important in order to maintain many physiological processes. If blood pressure receptors, so we have these receptors in our neck that are constantly monitoring our blood pressure. We also have these large receptors in the large vessels near our heart. And they detect, let's imagine if they're able to detect low blood pressure, the integrative center, which is the brain, would cause blood vessels in the body, remember those are the output targets, to constrict, and that would cause our blood pressure to go back up, to get closer back to that set point. So if the constriction overshoots the target set point, that would cause the vessels to relax. So this is a very dynamic feedback loop, and it's negative feedback is actually the most common type of feedback loop. Okay, one of the other most common examples that they give for negative feedback is body temperature. So once again, we have normal body temperature here in the middle, and then we say body temperature increases. Okay, so body temperature increases. That's the input information. Remember, it's going to send it to the integrative center or the control center, in this case, the brain. The brain is going to detect the changes. What's the response? To increase sweating, to get dilation of the skin. Sweating and increased blood flow is going to cause heat loss, going to cause your blood temperature to go down, return back to normal body temperature. So again, the body temperature was going up, and we get some type of response that pushes it back down. Okay, the opposite direction. Okay, we can go the other way. Okay, what happens if um, the change is the opposite direction, where body temperature decreases? Okay, well, now the brain is going to detect the changes, and it's going to cause a decrease in sweating, a constriction in the skin blood vessels, and also shivering. The decrease in sweating and the skin blood flow and the shivering is going to produce heat, and that's going to bring our body temperature back up. So again, the initial stimulus was cold, and the response was to heat us back up. So that's negative feedback. It goes towards the opposite direction of the initial response that brought us out of balance. That's negative feedback. Okay, let's talk about positive feedback. So, for positive feedback, these loops are a lot rarer, and these are generally not considered homeostatic like the negative feedback ones were. Now, these feedback loops initiate responses that actually reinforce the original stimulus. Okay, they make the original stimulus more exaggerative rather than decreasing it or removing it. Okay, and we sometimes say it sets up a vicious cycle. Now, after the integrative iteration of the loop, the original stimulus is moved farther from the normal set point. The escalation requires some sort of event that will terminate the loop. Okay, so these types of cycles need something that actually will terminate the loop. Otherwise, this condition will become pathologic. Now, not all positive feedback loops are pathological. For example, contractions of the uterine smooth muscle during childbirth is a good example of something that's normal, and it's a positive feedback loop. Blood clotting is another one. But the idea to understand here is that, with blood clotting, we said that positive feedback loops exaggerate the initial response. So for blood clotting, the initial response was platelets coming together and forming a clot. And as more platelets come together, that causes more platelets to be attracted to the clot area. Okay, and that's going to cause even more platelets to be attracted. And as you can see, that just causes a more exaggerative response. There has to be something that kind of cuts that cycle. Otherwise, we would keep having our blood clot until we just end up as one large clot, right? So again, positive feedbacks are a lot rarer. They're generally not seen as homeostatic as negative feedback loops. These feedback loops are going to initiate a response that reinforce the original stimulus rather than decreasing or removing it, like we said. And we said that these escalations require some sort of event that will terminate the loop. Otherwise, it'll become pathological. Okay, so the example that we have here for parturition or childbirth, so the baby moves deeper into the mother's birth canal. This is going to cause the cervix to stretch. That stretching cervix is going to send signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to then send impulses to the posterior pituitary, where oxytocin is stored. Okay, the posterior pituitary is going to release oxytocin into the blood. That blood that carries the oxytocin is eventually going to get to the uterus, and that's going to cause the uterus to actually contract even more forcefully. Okay, which will then cause the cervix to be stretched even more, which would then cause even more nerve impulses to go to the hypothalamus to release even more oxytocin. You see, that's like kind of a vicious cycle. And like we mentioned, that would continue. Now, finally, at birth, once the child has exited, the stretching of the cervix is over. Okay, that's that event that we were talking about that kind of stops everything. Okay, and the positive feedback cycle is broken. Okay, another mechanism to talk about here is feed-forward loops. Now, feed-forward loops are a bit different from feedback loops. These mechanisms anticipate changes in regulated variables and set into motion mechanisms that will preemptively attempt to reduce deviations from normal. Okay, and they always involve the central nervous system. So an example of this one, a really good one, is like the sight or the smell or the thought of food that will cause you to start salivating and to cause the stomach to start secreting secretions and everything in anticipation of food. So that's what we mean by feed-forward loops. Okay, feed-forward loops, again, are mechanisms that anticipate a future change. Okay, and then they're going to cause some type of motion of mechanism to come into play. All right. Now, before we get onto this slide here, just one more thing I want to talk about in reference to these loops. So set points are not constant. Very few biological set points are going to be constant. Many of these set points are going to change for different reasons. That's why we said that homeostasis is not static, that it's dynamic. Now, set points can change for physiological reasons, such as due to circadian rhythms, pregnancy. They can change due to different areas where we live. We call that acclimatization. Okay, so basically, if we live in higher altitudes, our bodies would have increased hematocrit in order to compensate. And we're going to study some of these during the course. Okay, now this next slide here, teleology and mechanisms, just really quickly, just to touch upon this. In this course, we are interested in how and why an organism functions. So I just want you to take note here that I separated how and why. I said in this course, we're interested in how and why organisms function. So let's ask a simple question and then we'll see how we might answer it. So the question is, why do red blood cells transport oxygen? Okay, and the answer, number one, for example, would be because other cells or other tissues of the body require oxygen to function. So again, why, or the teleological reason, which means we've given red blood cells oxygen a transport type purpose. And then answer number two might be because the molecule hemoglobin found in red blood cells will bind to oxygen. Okay, so how, in this case, is explaining the mechanism. So we understand that the mechanism behind red blood cell oxygen transport is the hemoglobin. Okay, so generally when I ask why, what I'm really looking for is how. So always think of the mechanisms behind why and you'll be on the right track. So again, if that confuses you, don't worry too much about it. Just something I wanted to touch upon. All right, and then we already talked a little bit about this earlier, the different levels of organization. So we said that everything that exists that we know of everything that is made up of matter is made up of different atoms. That's the smallest form of matter. Okay, now these atoms, which are the elements that we see on the periodic table, these are essentially chemicals, right? And that's essentially what we would say the chemical level of organization. Okay, so chemicals are going to be the components that end up forming cells. They form different components like nucleic acids, they form proteins, they form lipids. Okay, they form different components, but we start off with atoms, right? And we said these atoms come together. In this case, we're saying, we can form a couple of different molecules. Okay, for example, water. Okay, phospholipids, carbohydrates, proteins. Now, these molecules, we said, can come together to form different organelles, and those organelles would form cells. And then we said if we get multiple cells with a similar form and function, those cells would form tissues. And there are 4 basic types of tissues that we need to learn: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And if 2 or more of these tissues come together to form a larger structure, we're now at the organ level. So an organ is any structure that's made up of 2 or more tissues. So for example, the brain is a organ, the heart is an organ, the lungs is an organ, the liver is an organ. But then this one sometimes throws people off. The biceps brachii muscle is actually an organ, okay? Because it's made up of muscular tissue, it's made up of nervous tissue, it's made up of connective tissue. Okay, the femur bone is an organ. Okay, the eye is an organ. Okay, the femur, the bone, on its own is an organ. And when we account for all the different bones and how they work together, they form the organ system, which is the skeletal system. The biceps brachii is an organ, and when it comes together, it forms the muscular system. Okay? So those are organs. Those come together to form organ systems. Organ systems come together to form organisms. Organisms come together to form the populations of a species. Populations of species come together to form ecosystems of different species, and that forms the biosphere. Kind of going way out there, but yes. Most importantly, just, keep in mind chemicals. What are chemicals? Chemicals are the components of cells. Chemicals include things like nucleic acids, like proteins, like lipids, like carbohydrates. They end up forming cells. And we said that cells are the smallest unit of life. The functions of cells depend on what organelles that they have, essentially what structures, what internal structures they have. That dictates their function. And then we said tissues. Tissues are an organized group of cells. For example, muscle cells are going to form muscle tissues. And a tissue is usually not comprised of a single cell type, but rather a collection of 2 or more different types of cells, right? And also, it includes something we'll call the extracellular material that will function together with those cells. Now, here's a good time to bring up an important term called histology. Okay, histology is the study of tissues, while cytology would be the study of cells, individual cells. That's cytology. The study of tissues would be histology. Okay? So there's 4 basic types of tissues in the body. We said epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Epithelial tissue is going to line surfaces, and it forms barriers. So the lining of the digestive tract and your skin is made up of epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is actually the most diverse. There's several different types of connective tissue we're going to learn about. Actually, even bone is a type of connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. Adipose, blood, is connective tissue. So the main idea behind connective tissue is that it's composed of cells that are contained within what we call an extracellular matrix that includes certain fibers and something else called ground substance. Muscle, that's another type of tissue. So muscle is a unique type of tissue due to its ability to contract, okay, to cause movement, to change shape. Okay, now examples include the biceps muscle, the heart, and the muscles of the intestines. And then finally, nervous tissue. This type of tissue functions to communicate, in communication and carrying messages over long distances very rapidly in the body. So we said that these different tissues that we just mentioned, epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural, those are going to come together to form organs. Okay, now organs are comprised of more than one type of tissue, and they're going to form a distinct structure. So a couple of examples here: arteries, which are made up of epithelial tissue, they're made up of smooth tissue, they're made up of connective tissue. That's an organ. Okay, the heart, like we mentioned, that's also made up of epithelial tissue, that's also made up of connective and cardiac muscle tissue. So that's another organ. Okay, so an organ isn't just the classic organ that I want you to think that you probably think of, like a heart or kidney. Okay, but I want you to think of other things like a single muscle, like the bicep, which would also be considered an organ. Okay, now different organs come together to form organ systems. So these are comprised, organ systems are comprised of multiple components, multiple tissues, multiple organs, which will provide a distinct set of functions of the body. All right, so the next thing that we can kind of talk about is, what are the different organ systems? Right, so we have the integumentary system, for example. Okay, so that's going to provide protection from environmental hazards, plays a role in temperature control. There's the skeletal system that's going to provide support, protection, stores minerals, produces blood. There's the muscular system that's going to produce movement, also provides support, also produces heat. There's the nervous system, plays a role in coordination of other systems, usually considered in immediate response, immediate messaging, immediate signaling for the nervous system. Also plays a role in memory. The endocrine system, that's long distance communication. So that's similar to the nervous system, but we talk about long distance communication, and we talk about responses that are not immediate, but responses that are usually that take longer time to function. Okay, and the endocrine system works closely with the nervous system. There's also the cardiovascular system that plays a role in the movement of cells and dissolved materials. It also consists of the heart and the blood vessels. There's the lymphatic system that provides defense against infections, returns fluids to the cardiovascular system. There's the respiratory system that's going to deliver oxygen, or help at least in the delivery of oxygen, the removal of carbon dioxide. The digestive system, which is going to process and absorb nutrients, wastes. The urinary system, that's going to eliminate the wastes, regulates body fluid composition, controls pH. And the reproductive system, okay, that's going to produce the sex cells, produces hormones, supports embryonic development from fertilization to birth in females. Okay, so those are the different body systems, discussing in the next several weeks. Again, please remember that the course does include access to a textbook, which is the OpenStax Anatomy and Physiology textbook. So be sure that you're reading that textbook along with going over these presentations. So I would have hoped that you had read the chapter before listening and viewing this presentation. Um, so that's what I would recommend, that you read the chapter before, then view my presentation, and if it still didn't make sense, go ahead and read the chapter again in the book. By that time, it should make perfect sense, what you've read and what's important. And then I also supply my PowerPoint presentations. They're on the Canvas course, so you can download that and review it and study it. I also supply my lecture notes, so that's available to you as well. And there's also a lot of other resources available on the Canvas course if you click through all the links. So make sure that you're doing that, okay? Make sure that you're clicking through the links and getting accustomed and familiar with all of that. All right, and if there's any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I hope you have a great rest of your night. Okay, and that concludes our first lecture.